Hello and welcome. My name is Dan Chase, and I'll be giving you a presentation on a new look on business requirements, which is really a brief overview of agile versus traditional development, in the hopes that it helps us bring IT and business closer together in a collaboration for basically being able to achieve more in a smaller amount of time together. So first I'll go over the traditional process of software development. Traditionally, business requirements have consisted of a write-up which describes new functionality needed for the development project. It's got to be written in a language that technology can understand, which is the point, but also simple enough for the business to verify. So a high-level cost is determined, authorized for a project, but in this presentation, let's skip that rest and fast forward to where the project now has the green light along with deadlines. Sounds like I've really skipped a lot, but actually in many cases, everything else I've described so far gets skipped, except for the deadline part. That's always real. So it would seem as most have the misfortune to learn that regardless of what the books say, there's never really enough resources to document business requirements. The stakeholders just don't have time for additional meetings, and they find it difficult to answer new questions from the project team. I've been involved in a lot of large projects where there was no project manager, no business analyst due to the expense overhead, or maybe because you just didn't have anybody available at the time. So if we don't solve that problem, what ends up happening is the development team has to figure it out, and then basically they don't meet all the requirements. The weeks start going by, the scope gets pulled back, and until funding runs out, time runs out, and only a small piece is done. The business feels misled and begins to have doubts about their IT department's ability to complete projects, which complicates future funding. So you have business sponsors that provide the funding and operational supports like a VP or a director. You have business analysts who get the requirements. You have a project manager who organizes tasks and manages the timeline. Developers create features based on requirement documentation. All these steps, all these people that are involved, and if you've ever played the telephone game, you know how communication can get. But the worst part is the one at the bottom. The business sponsor gets high-level updates from the project manager. So in other words, the business sponsor doesn't really know what the real true status is and what's been done and what's not. So all they can do is hold them to the original timeline that they've given them. So you have typical issues due to this methodology. You have a discrepancy in what was asked for versus what was created. Timelines are based on management's patience. It needs to be done in 6 weeks. Well, where'd they get that number? I don't know. They're just trying to see how fast we can do it. Or maybe funding will run out at the end of the year and they only have 2 months left. So things like that's based on management's patience, and so that's very bad because you end up cutting back on the project to meet those deadlines, and more often than not, you just miss them. Decisions are made without business sponsor involvement. In other words, yes, you need to cut back on what you're going to work on. What do you cut back on? Well, sometimes it's made without even asking. Changes in direction are unplanned by default, meaning that the whole thing is set up based upon a delivery will be made at a certain date. And it's the planning is such as though we don't expect any changes, but we know that there are changes. So this results in pressure, lots of pressure on the project team. Everybody works long hours to accommodate the now unreasonable timelines as things get added to the project workload. And the finished product only represents a portion of what was expected. So that's not good, right? So Agile. So if we look at Agile, basically, if we back up and say, what is Agile? Because I know you probably used it in your company. You might have heard or read about it, but let's get to what it is. There's a manifesto out there. It's on agilemanifesto.org, and that's exactly, that's where it started. So I would encourage you to read it. But it basically is individuals and interactions over process and tools. So where's my Microsoft project? Well, maybe you don't need Microsoft project. We're not doing a Gantt chart. This Agile is a methodology, a way of thinking about a project more than it is how you control and manage it. Working software over comprehensive documentation. So it's minimally viable documentation. What does a senior developer need to know about the software if they're going to work on it? That's it. No table of contents, no attribution to the authors, no introductory sentences. Really, it's just a reference sheet at best, usually. Minimally viable documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, which means we're all in this together. It's not like a third party where you're going to tell me I need to deliver it in a certain amount of time and I'm going to agree or else. In responding to change over following a plan. In other words, and there's that timeline again. It's like, well, there is no timeline because there really is no particular plan. We're responding to the changes. We're going to assume it's going to change. So, what you need for Agile is you need cross-functional project teams. You need the projects to be broken down in a series of iterations. Each one is considered a success of its own. You need face-to-face communication between business and development. So in other words, the developer in the traditional plan is never going to really talk to a business person. They're going to go through a business analyst and a project manager and all these other people. But with Agile, the business is involved. You call the business sponsor, or you call the product owner, and you say, "Hey, what did you mean when you said that you need to be able to control this?" And they will tell them, and then they'll get it right the first time. So you focus on individual features rather than a whole product. So Agile is a way of thinking about the project. And then you have something else called Scrum, which is a method by which Agile projects are commonly managed. So that's the whole, how do you do these kinds of things within a team? So Scrum, which it gets lumped in with Agile all the time, involves ceremonies. So this is where your daily stand-up comes in. Just because you're doing a daily stand-up does not mean you're doing Agile. It means you're having daily stand-ups. Again, Agile is a way of thinking, not a management practice. Discuss what you've done today. I'm sorry, for a stand-up, you discuss what you've done yesterday and what you're working on today and any blockers. There are no status updates in this. People will try to make a status update and it'll take forever. It is not supposed to be a status update. Sprint planning, what are we going to accomplish in the next iteration? A retrospect to say what went well, what went wrong, and then what happens. Everything features like go into a product backlog to say, okay, here's all the features that we need to do. So the business analyst is now a product owner and they manage the backlog. Developers choose which features they want to work on their own. They just go, hey, I'll work on that one. So they'll automatically pick the ones they're good at and the ones they enjoy. The project manager is now the Scrum Master and focuses on removing obstacles, much like a manager would. So there's benefits to Agile and Scrum. Developers get information directly from the business. Feedback's given early and often. The team plans for changes rather than rigid deliverables. The business maintains control, and the timeline is no longer even discussed. The work just speaks for itself. They're already using the software. They're just not using all the features, which is really important to everybody. So here's an example of a Agile project, an address book. So what you do is you need to collect user stories in Agile. So it's usually as a blank, I need to be able to blank so that I can blank. So here's an example of as a business manager, I need to be able to add, update, and remove entries from the address book so that I can keep track of client information. These are very concise statements so that it's very easy for somebody to understand what the software needs to do. And it makes the person who's writing it think a little bit more high level about what they're trying to get out of the software. Because sometimes business users will try to dictate exactly how the software works, and we also get into trouble from that. So here's a breakdown example of a backlog. So as you can see, there's all features and bugs. So we got a feature, add new entry, a feature, remove an existing. So I'm, as a developer, might go, hey, I'll work on removing an existing entry, and I'll also work on archiving. And somebody else will grab updating, and somebody else will, so everybody just works on a piece of it, and then as they're done, they get into the deliverable. So in 2 weeks we're going to have maybe add, remove, and update, and then we'll talk about the next 2 weeks after that. So until then, the business can add, remove, and update. So what are the problems with Agile? There are many problems with Agile, obviously, but most of it has to do with people just not understanding. Hype is something that has gripped Agile, the term. Everybody says, hey, let's do Agile. We're doing stand-up, so therefore we're doing Agile. We're using Jira, so therefore we're doing Agile. We have Scrum Masters, so therefore we're doing Agile. But they're going wrong in the way that Agile has nothing to do with how you do it. It's a thought process. It's engagement with the business to say, hey, you're involved in this. We're all in the same boat, and the business is happy about Agile. They want to be involved in it. They actually at my previous employer had positions for Agile project manager, which means that they're basically setting the goal that they want to work in an Agile manner with development. So I think that's very important and exciting. But inadequate experience with Agile methods, just because the whole company is new to it and they have to learn, so they do the ceremonies, but they don't really understand them, and then we have a hard time, bubbling those up. Little understanding of the required broader organizational change. In other words, how does my piece fit in? And then the company philosophy or culture sometimes is at odds with the Agile values, especially when it comes to things like delegation. Do I trust the developers to do what I say to do without a project manager or somebody else vetting it out before I see it? Those kinds of things are growth opportunities for the companies. So there's a lot of information on these particular problems at the PMI link that's on the page. So either way, it's a very nice way of doing things, a wonderful methodology. Agile is a wonderful way of thinking. Scrum is a wonderful methodology. So I encourage you to give it a try, dig a little deeper, read about it. Even if your company is trying to get into it, you can truly be a leader in helping IT come together on business requirements with the business in a leadership manner and help them understand how to move quicker as a team rather than two distinct parties. Well, thank you very much for your time, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful day. This is my presentation. Thank you.